Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 34. On this episode of the Lizzie Borden Podcast, we are pleased to bring you a reading of the Purloined Curio by author Richard Behrens. It is one of the earlier stories in the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective mysteries. The title is no doubt an homage to Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter. The story includes a nefarious medium who is hired by a bereft widow in the hope that she may make contact with her departed husband. All is not as it seems, and it is up to Lizzie Borden, Girl Detective, to put things right. The story explores the spiritualism movement in the late 19th century New England, which was of popular interest to the author. Richard Behrens also includes his usual wry humor and comic characters that make this story so unique and enjoyable. The story is read by a voice conjured by artificial intelligence. We hope that you enjoy this reading of The Purloined Curio.
A Lizzie Borden Girl Detective mystery story by Richard Behrens. The Purloined Curio. 1875, French Street, Fall River, Massachusetts. Voices from the Summerlands. Sarah Durfee Borden was growing weary of the pretense of mystery, of her mother's face glowing in the kerosene light, of the twins' cries of astonishment as each new trumpet blast sounded beyond the shadows in the far corner of the parlour. But what she was tired of the most was Elizabeth Wingate's flabby jowls nodding and chortling in some pathetic act of spirit possession. All in all, Sarah was sick of the endless seances and dancing flames, of loud snapping table raps and candlelight, of cold wisps blasted from over her shoulder to make her believe that her dead father was somehow in the room. Young Sarah, not quite 15 years of age, born and bred in the Fall River parlours that were more suited for salons than spirit rooms, knew a charlatan when she saw one, and Elizabeth Wingate, despite her aristocratic airs and altruistic demeanour, was a fraud of the first order, a hoax mistress, a travelling snake oil peddler. How much money had the widow Borden, her mother, spent on these endless rituals of hocus-pocus and supposed spirit visitations? How many textile dividends had been liquidated in sacrifice to Wingate's bank account? How many superstitions and weaknesses in her mother's character had been exploited by this fraud? The silly woman who had claimed that by using spirit visitation, not only would she reunite Mrs. Borden with her dear, departed husband, but would also locate his missing will. Jonathan Borden is but a mere whisper, a glimmering cloud passing through the Summerlands, the corpulent Englishwoman said in a low, rumbling voice. Mrs. Borden, you are the flame that is attracting him to our sphere of matter. He yearns only to be close again to your material manifestation. Where is my John? Mrs. Borden cried, her face wet with her own burning sadness. I want to hear his voice once more. The young twins cowered in their high chairs, small beings terrified by flickering lights and dark shadows that they could not understand. Papa, said the one on the left. They still could not comprehend his absence, and this farcical charade was only confusing them. Sarah rolled her eyes and pressed her hands against the gilt tablecloth. Don't forget to ask him to empty his slops. There's an awful smell. The mother slapped an open hand down hard. Sarah, be still! Another trumpet blast came through the brocaded wall. The widow Borden jumped at its sudden eruption. What's the point, Mother? Asked Sarah impatiently. This is all theatre. There are no trumpets of the dead. I bet if you search the backyard, you'll find an associate of this faker hunched behind your crunch berry bush with a small horn to deliver his blasts on cue." She poked an evil eye at Wingate, who flustered in her seat, attempting to preserve an aura of solemn trance. "I would prefer you to attach your leech-like tentacles to some other poor widow, and not my mother." Wingate opened one eye and let it periscope towards Sarah. "Hush," the Englishwoman said, raising a chubby finger to her lips. "Your father is just passing through the veil." The widow Borden said exhaustedly, "Stop insulting our guest, Sarah. She is not a fake. She studied with the Fox sisters." Sarah yelled out, "Fiddlesticks!" and fled from the table, pulling at the drapery and upsetting the candle that fell to the side and sputtered out. Within moments, she was in her bedroom, reclined on her lounge and sobbing liberally. Now she was in a fine imbroglio. She had wanted to give Elizabeth Wingate a piece of her mind for several months, now but remained silent, while her mother's dwindling wealth had financed these greedy charades. If only her father had properly filed his will with the probate office. Surely he had anticipated his death by creating the document, so why had he hid it in a place where no one could find it? Why did he take that secret with him to his grave? Sarah knew that for her to expose this spiritual fraud, she would need help from an expert. But who could prove Wingate's deceptions or find her father's will? As Sarah pondered these questions, she happened to glance at her writing table and saw a framed photograph of her associates at the Women's Temperance Society. In the center, beaming with pride and decked in her Sunday tulle finest, was Sarah Borden, her eyes glowing with the optimism of youth. She remembered the day of the photograph with fondness and nostalgia, for at that time her father had been alive to witness his daughter's accomplishments. Right next to her in the picture was a plump, distant cousin of hers, one of the less prosperous Bordens, with her smooth round cheeks and protruding blue-grey eyes. Here was a girl whom Sarah had shared a high school classroom with, had sat next to at temperance lectures, and to whom she had confided some secrets that only girls could share. "Yes," thought Sarah, "how absurd! I should have thought of it from the beginning. I shall consult with Lizzie Andrew Borden, the girl detective." A private consultation. The Borden house on 2nd Street was a quaint example of the Greek Revival architecture that populated the Down Street area. Each time Sarah came down from the hill, engaged on business, a social visit, or to help with her mother's banking errands, she was struck by how crowded and small everything seemed, and the Borden house was no exception. It was pressed against the bustling sidewalk where peddlers and pedestrians challenged each other for space. Sometimes, in the Down Street area, Sarah would catch a glimpse of Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, who was tall, thin, and a bit spectral, with his unkempt locks and grim, straight-lined mouth that always seemed clenched. He radiated some intense and unsympathetic aloofness. It was known that this self-made man had sold coffins, and it was rumored that he was a penny pincher, that he kept his wife and 2 daughters on a tight leash, that he negotiated each and every coin in any business transaction, and prided himself on never having spent a foolish dollar. Outside his house on 2nd Street, about to knock and call upon his daughter, Lizzie Borden, the girl detective, Sarah had to muster all her courage. Fortunately, it was the mother, Abby, who opened the door. She seemed humourless, but pleasant enough. "Are you here to see Lizzie?" she inquired, and Sarah nodded slightly. "She's upstairs reading her Plutarch, but I'm sure she is receiving." Sarah was ushered up a high, narrow, and bending staircase to a 2nd-floor landing. Abby Borden, who was physically drained from the demanding climb up the stairs, pointed to what was presumably Lizzie's bedroom door. "Just knock and she'll answer. Now, if you'll forgive me, I must lie down. I've been dusting all morning and I'm fairly exhausted." And then she disappeared into the guest room, a feather duster flicking about her like a tiny bird. After knocking on Lizzie's door, it was opened a crack, and Sarah saw those wonderful eyes peering outwards. "My word!" came an exclamation from within. "Sarah Durfee Borden, my favourite cousin!" The door flew open, and Sarah was confronted by a cheerful Lizzie. "What brings you here to brighten my day that is otherwise occupied with dreary Roman classics? Come on in, please, and sit with me." The door widened, and Sarah was ushered into the bedroom. A single bed was angled in the corner, covered with a blue embroidered bedspread. Behind it was what seemed to be a communicating door to another part of the house. To Sarah's right was a fainting couch in front of the right-hand window, and a chest of drawers. To the left was a desk and chair with bookcase above. Another bookcase was against the far wall, liberally sprinkled with book spines, and draped over with a velvet portiere. There were elegant prints of cathedrals and European edifices hanging from the walls. It was the bedroom of a cultured, intelligent, but cloistered young woman. "What a lovely room you have here," Sarah said pleasingly. "What wonderful southern exposure." "Actually," Lizzie said with a sly smile, "this room belongs to Emma. The poor girl is visiting in Newport, and I've temporarily taken over. If she ever suspects I'm using it as an office for my consulting agency, she'll have a fit. She will." Lizzie pointed to a room off to the side that looked small enough to comfortably stable a horse. "That's my room over there. But this is just our secret now, isn't it?" Lizzie motioned Sarah to the fainting couch. "Please," she said, and gracefully sank with her into the cushioned seat. "What can I do for you today?" "Lizzie Borden," Sarah said, leaping forward with her clenched hands. "I am told you are a solver of mysteries." "Why, yes," Lizzie said with a wry smile. "I have been quite successful at solving some other puzzles that local consulting detectives have been baffled by. I helped the constabulary solve the case of the Portuguese reprobate, and I was quite useful during the affair of Mrs. Wilmoth's immovables. And," Sarah interjected, "I did hear gossip about your role in the riddle of the forlorn Maggie." Lizzie chuckled as if she were recalling an amusing anecdote. "I did not even think that one made it into the record. Well, all of these affairs earned me commendations directly from the town judiciary." She pointed to a framed certificate hanging above her writing table. "I am considering a full-blown career in criminal detection if my father will provide capital for my tuition." "Your credentials are indeed impeccable, and that is why I am coming to you today. For you see, I have a mystery unfolding within my very house. As you may know, my mother, Victoria Borden, of the Anawan Street Bordens, is the poor widow of Jonathan Borden, of the French Street Bordens. 6 months ago, almost to this very day, my father died under mysterious circumstances while managing one of the Livermore mills. We do believe it to be foul play. He was found in an apoplectic state and quite dead. The cause of the death was never confirmed." "My word," Lizzie said, holding 2 fingertips to her ovaled mouth. "That would be foul play indeed. Is there anyone that you think would harbour such hateful feelings towards your father?" "Yes. He is Thisbot Livermore, of the Taunton Livermores, the owner of the mill my father died in. A fouler man I cannot suspect, with his odious cigars and his corpulent belly. As a little girl, I felt my skin crawl when he entered the room. For years I endured his sly flirtations, and now we suspect that he hired the agent who terminated my father's life. To make matters worse, we cannot find my father's will. That document would have provided for my surviving family, but alas, we are left with a legal morass that threatens to have all my father's property turned over to Livermore. Unfortunately, my mother seeks to solve this problem through supernatural agencies. Supernatural? Lizzie said. Give me more details. A British spiritualist, Elizabeth Wingate. Perhaps you have seen her lecture in town about the sevenfold rays of man's spiritual origins. She is a fraud, I believe, and possibly an agent of Livermore, attempting to infiltrate my intimate family circle and obtain information about the hiding place of my father's will. I cannot prove that Livermore is behind Wingate's fraud. But if I could, it would go a long way to proving that Livermore was behind my father's demise. This Elizabeth Wingate? Has she come recommended? No. She approached us after hearing of our plight. We inquired about town and found out that she has worked with the Fox sisters in upstate New York, but it is doubtful that anything said about her has veracity. Has your mother shown any previous interest in the spiritual arts to warrant such gullibility? Not quite, Sarah said, and then paused, pressing her lips together. Well, said Lizzie, it seems you are remembering something of importance. Quite right, Lizzie. You see, my mother has a spirit box. Lizzie's eyes widened. A spirit box? Yes, a small curiosity Father picked up in a dusty antique store down street. Father was particularly afraid of it after he brought it home and was loath to touch it. Afraid? Yes, it was said that it was haunted by evil spirits, particularly an angry ghost of a savage Indian who wants revenge for the atrocities committed by the white colonists some 100 years ago when Fall River was not yet even a town. Some say the ghost is that of our Washunks, Squaw Say Shem of the Sarconet. They say she was condemned to dwell within the box by King Philip himself. Lizzie shuddered. King Philip, a Wampanoag Say Shem, had been killed almost 200 years before, during a very bloody war with the English. Many a time in her childhood, her father had told her, "Be a good little girl, or King Philip will be waiting for you in your bedroom." The thought had always haunted her deepest dreams. Drawing herself together, Lizzie uttered, "But one cannot truly believe the box to be haunted?" "My father did, and he went to great lengths to train us from an early age not to touch it. It sits there, alas, in Mother's cabinet of curiosities in the parlour, collecting dust. No one, especially Mother, dares to touch it." Lizzie's eyebrows furrowed. "Does this Elizabeth Wingate know about this spirit box?" "Well, yes. Mother was particularly interested in getting Wingate's opinion as to its supposed possession. Wingate wanted to take it with her to examine it, perhaps to perform a spiritual rite that would clear it of any possession, but Mother became hysterical and told her that no human on earth should touch it, or else it would unleash King Philip himself, and we shall all be brought to woe. Wingate told her to leave it be for now, and when they have contacted my dear father's spirit in the beyond, they will ask his counsel on the nature of the spirit box's inhabitant." "So, Wingate is interested in this curio?" "Very much so. We certainly hope the old woman has some truth in her claims for supernatural powers. We would certainly love to have that old spirit box cleared of spirits. I have had many nightmares about that damned box." Lizzie Borden, the girl detective, glowered in the dusty afternoon light. She scratched her chin and then pressed her hands against her bengaline dress. "Sarah, in a few scant moments, You have provided me with a complex mystery that will indeed be a challenge. I shall take this case, and I ask for nothing more in return than a most excellent and hearty meal, and an evening's delightful banter with your wonderful family when the affair is finished." "Certainly, Lizzie Borden," Sarah said happily. "You are indeed a gem of a girl. When do we begin?" "Right this very moment. I shall inform my father's wife that I am going down street. I believe he can help gain information about this Livermore character. I wish to assess him myself." The two girls left the room and entered the guest bedroom, which they were surprised to find empty. "Mrs. Borden must have finished her chores," Lizzie announced. They were startled to hear Abby's dour voice come from behind the bed where she lay on the bare floor, invisible to their eyes. "Over here, Lizzie. I seem to have fallen off the bed while napping. Can you take a moment to help me to my feet?" "Lizzie," Sarah said with alarm, "your mother is in peril." Lizzie took a deep breath, her eyes twisting upwards with a forceful annoyance, and muttered, "She is not my mother. She is my stepmother." An investment pitch. Andrew Borden, a tall, dark figure, grim like a provincial undertaker who had just come into some inheritance, ambled down the street on his way home for dinner. His thin, emotionless mouth and cold marble eyes greeted his fellow citizens who bothered to tip their hats and say a kind word of greeting. "Good day, Mr. Borden," said one corpulent gentleman. "Good day, Borden," Andrew muttered back, nodding his head. He vaguely remembered the man, J.F. Borden, or was it T.E. Borden, or perhaps that was another Borden. He couldn't keep them all calculated in his head, and it sufficed to just call them Borden. No one would question him since he was a man of means, and could walk down street with dignity and respect. He reached his home and climbed the steps, retrieving his key from his pocket. In the front hallway, he was met by his youngest daughter, who came up on him from behind and tapped his shoulder. He seemed more than a little perturbed as he placed his hat on a standing rack. "Nay, daughter," the poker-faced patriarch muttered. "Coming at me in such a manner is not fitting. What is your business?" He stepped into the sitting room to get his newspapers, and Lizzie followed. She smiled devilishly and slid onto the low sofa against the far wall. "Nothing, father. I am merely curious how your day went." $27 in revenue for the Maple Street property," he bemoaned as he flipped through the papers, plus a plundering of my daily tills from Mr. Carpentier, who seems to have forgotten that his talents lay more in the peddling of feather beds than in the creative fiddling of my audits. "I'm sorry to hear that, father, but I'm wondering if you are better off putting your energies towards the associations within the textile community than building furniture that you sell at most excellent prices befitting our Commonwealth." Andrew peered up from his news stories, his eyes twitching. "What the devil do you mean, daughter? Borden and Almy is doing well by me?" "Yes, but there is great money in banking and textiles. I hear that Mr. Livermore is without a partner these days. His former co-president is simply late of this world, having died at the mill a few months back." "I have heard of such things. J.A. Borden was a far cousin of mine, and I believe he left his widow with sufficient funds. Livermore is not someone I ever had a fondness for. His reputation recently has been a bit scandalous." "How so?" Lizzie asked. "Many say it is a mistress. His poor wife does suffer. I say that these times are not befitting for a man of industry." "I suppose there is no harm in offering him your financial services, father. I'm sure he could be quite reasonable when presented with a flow of money. After all, he is one of the most important textile merchants in town." Borden brooded by the fireplace, his fingers tapping on his watch fob. I suppose you are correct. I shall pay him a visit anon. What better time than the present, Lizzie said. I hear he takes his dinner in his mansion between 11 and noon, and it is within a short walk from here. Up the damned hill! Andrew scowled. I swear an oath, daughter, you are going to be the death of me. Lizzie smiled and patted the horsehair sofa that was so comfortable beneath her on this quaint summer afternoon. Why, father, such a horrible thing to say, she coyly whispered. The Dragon's Den. On the street, a bowler-hatted gentleman lifted his palm to his brim. Good day, Borden. Good day, Borden, Lizzie's father replied, and then gave a polite nod to a passing woman. Good day, Mrs. Borden. God's graces on you, Mr. Borden, she said with a solemn nod of her own. And how is Mr. Borden this fine forenoon? Asked Andrew. None too well. He is currently consulting for his health with Dr. Borden. Would that be the Dr. Borden of Borden Street? No, said Mrs. Borden. That would be the other Dr. Borden. My word, you are correct. Forgive me, Mrs. Borden. Think not upon it, Mr. Borden. And they were past. How many Bordens are there in Fall River, father? Lizzie asked, clutching his big-knuckled hand. Not enough for confusion, Andrew said loftily, then tipped his hat to another passing gentleman. Good day, Borden, he announced. Eventually, Lizzie and her father stood before the stately Livermore mansion. Overhead, clouds passed behind its gables with gaseous indifference. If only, Lizzie mused, you had bought us such a fine dwelling on this hill instead of that midget cheese box on 2nd Street. Hush, her father said, raising a single finger to his thin lips. Be quiet, daughter. Do not stress my patience. A harried butler answered the door and took Andrew's card, peering up at him as if he were his better. Andrew huffed his way into the house, and Lizzie followed. After a time sequestered in a drawing-room, father and daughter staring at a billiard table that was so large it wouldn't even fit into their parlour. The teakwood doors flew open, and in strolled Thisbolt Ajax Livermore, holding a wide beer flagon, his mouth stuffed with a generously rolled cigar. The textile tycoon was more corpulent than Lizzie had imagined. His face was a fiery splotching of skin disorders, as if some fierce mould had hatched on his lower chin and spread across his mutton chops, ear and forehead. There was also the glistening of medicinal gel that gave his head the appearance of wet, rotting fruit. Lizzie fought back the urge to turn away her disgusted eyes. Borden, he said, dipping his chin in Andrew's direction. Mr. Livermore, Andrew said with reverence and a bit of awe. Lizzie had never seen her father humbled so. How are you doing on this fair day? Livermore puckered his lips. Posh and twaddle, have you not heard of the unfortunate Mr. Tweed of New York? He has been apprehended, and is now wallowing in a common prison cell. Livermore puffed on his cigar like it was an extension of his face. An inky cloud wafted about his speckled head. Borden, that is alarming news. I do not believe men of industry are respected in this day and age. No good can come of that. Lizzie took a breath and interjected. I do believe Mr. Tweed to be of a criminal disposition unbefitting an elected political official. I do not think a cell can be low or dank enough for his kind. Pinpointed eyes emerged from the darkening smoke. Borden, you must have a sit-down with this young lady and correct her misdirected thinking. I endeavour to acculturate, Andrew sighed. Lizzie, however, directs her thoughts elsewhere. There is nothing misdirected about my thoughts, Lizzie said, pulling at her ruffles. I merely suggest that no man, no matter how wealthy or industrious, should be above the law. If Mr. Tweed has robbed New York City of millions, he must be called to justice. The courts shall decide, Livermore said, choking on the dusty air. Meanwhile, Tweed is indisposed to a chamber not befitting a man of his industrious character. He paused to sip from his flagon. After lifting his dripping face from the brew, he sputtered, "But such talk merely takes us from our purpose. What can I do for you today, Mr. Borden?" "Lizzie here has advised me to hitch my wagon to your train, so to speak. She suggests that I invest my money in your textile interests." Livermore took 2 puffs of his cigar and said with a grunt, "How much and how soon?" Andrew fell back on his heels. "Well, I suppose we can set up a meeting at the bank to discuss the particulars." There was silence in the room for a space. "No particulars," Livermore shrugged. "Just sign a check at the front office." "For what amount?" her father stuttered. His legs were visibly trembling. Livermore's eyebrows extended to the top of his pasty scalp. "How the blazes should I know? You're the one who made the offer. What's your game? I've seen you, Borden. You make featherbeds and coffins, don't you? You grew up on Ferry Street. You raised yourself from the shame of nothing to where you are today, just like myself. Give me all you can spare, and in return, I'll give you a cut of the great expansion that is about to occur. Are you not a man of vision? Do you not have financial instincts?" He paused and savoured his tobacco, then stared back at Andrew. "Is that all? What are you gawking at?" Andrew's fingers clutched at his side. He seemed to be trembling from the top of his pate to the bottom of his Congress boots. Yes. I suppose that is all." "Yes. Well, I do believe you have turned out to be a fine ally, Borden. I look forward to seeing your money. I suppose that would be advantageous to both of us. Good day, Mr. Livermore, and I thank you for your time." "Yes, my time." Livermore turned towards the massive fireplace that dominated one wall of the room and stared up at the array of framed daguerreotypes that fringed the mantel. "I have nothing but time, Mr. Borden." Lizzie and her father interpreted the sight of his back and the smoke curling from his head that it was time to leave. Back on the front porch, Andrew stared down at his daughter and pressed his lips together. "My fortune at a clap," he groaned. "Nonsense, father. Livermore will take good care of you. He'll treasure your contribution." "What is this really about, Lizzie? My word, girl, you are never what you seem." "Not what I seem, father," Lizzie said, beaming, "but what I have seen." The framed daguerreotype of Elizabeth Wingate, nestled on Livermore's mantelpiece, sitting in the prized position dead center between images of illustrious colleagues and family members, had told her all she needed to know about the connection between the fake spiritualist and the textile tycoon. A widow's predicament. Sarah Borden met Lizzie Borden downstreet at the apothecary as she was leaving with a string-tied bag of rat poison. Her most excellent cousin was beaming with rosy cheeks. "Did you discover something, Miss Lizzie?" "I prefer to remain reserved on the subject, Sarah. For now, I wish to accompany you on a social visit to your mother. I have much to discuss with her." An hour later, they were seated in the very parlour room where Wingate's ceremonies were enacted. Lizzie sat with the Borden family, the twins bouncing around the room with urgent energy, and the widow Borden, grim and sallow-looking, seated in her chair of mourning, her eyes begging for respite. "It has been a trying ordeal," the widow Borden was saying. "Elizabeth is doing the best that she can, but these things take time. Once you have become a shade in the Summerlands, it is very difficult to maintain contact with the material world. But I'm hoping that Jonathan's resolve to fulfill his love for me is stronger than those incorporeal bonds that are tying him to the afterlife." Or perhaps, Sarah quipped, we aren't paying Wingate enough money. I'm sure if we doubled her salary, suddenly Father would start yapping. Sarah, came the maternal rebuttal, please be reverent towards Mrs. Wingate, especially in the presence of our guest. You must consider, Mrs. Borden, Lizzie said boldly, the possibility that the spiritualist is not quite as effective in her conjurations as she may have advertised. Nonsense. She comes with the highest recommendations. And Sarah joined her mother in unison, studied with the Fox sisters, and then added, what a load of horse droppings. The widow Borden's eyes went milky as she thought back into the past. I went to a performance of the Fox sisters in New York a few years back. They were performing at the Academy of Music and drew quite a large crowd. They brought back a young boy who had been crushed under a mule at a Nyack farm. He wandered across the stage with these large, accusing eyes. It was the most frightful thing I had ever seen, but it filled me with the strength I needed to endure Jonathan's death. I felt for the first time that there is hope, that he is not forever lost. Sarah said grimly, Mother, this has gone too far. Lizzie Borden is here to help you find the will, not to contact the dead. Lizzie's eyes strayed towards the cabinet of curiosities that flanked the far wall. It was large and heavy, with bronze claw feet and decorative flanged framings. Inside lay various items, many of them primitive artifacts that the Bordens had picked up from Jonathan Borden's sea voyages when he was a textile merchant abroad. African idol heads, juju sticks, and other implements of superstitious value. Perhaps the will is hidden somewhere on the premises. Perhaps in one of the curiosities in your cabinet, stuffed perhaps into a voodoo doll. Alas, the widow Borden said resignedly, I have examined all those items. All of them? With the exception of that. She pointed with a trembling finger. Prominently, in the center cube of the cabinet, sitting alone with plenty of breathing space on both sides, was a large rectangular box, noticeably Western in style, with shellacked seashells delicately placed in a rim along the joint lines. The spirit box, Sarah said. She got to her feet and started towards the cabinet, but halted, her feet glued into place. For someone so unbelieving, she confessed, I'm afraid of that thing. Father himself told me of the evil that dwells within. We must leave it for now, the widow Borden said solemnly. It is cursed and cannot be touched or moved. When we ever depart this house, for whatever reason, we must leave it behind. Let the next resident of 9 French Street inherit our heavy burden. How did the spirit box get in the house in the first place? Lizzie asked. Surely it didn't just appear one night. No, that it didn't. It was my beloved Jonathan who brought it home from work one day. He said that it must never be opened, ever, except on one occasion. And what occasion would that be? Asked Lizzie. In case of his death, he said it must be turned over to his lawyer at once, that only Joseph Coffin of New Bedford, his lifelong solicitor, knew how to undo the curse of King Philip. And I never heard of a lawyer practicing the spiritual arts. It struck me as odd indeed, but Jonathan himself filled us with such fear that we cannot even touch it to give it to Coffin. We figured we'd rather let it sit there and contain its evil rather than take the risk of Coffin exposing us all to woe. Sarah said quietly, There may be a connection with Thisbolt Livermore and that box. Hush, said her mother. There's no point in withholding information from the only person who can help us, Mother. She turned to Lizzie. Livermore was over for dinner with his dreary wife, this raggedy thing he drags behind him whenever he wants to make a splash on the social register. And in the middle of cigars and brandy in the billiards room, Livermore excused himself and went to find the water closet. When he didn't return, Father set out to fetch him and discovered him in the parlour trying to break into the cabinet of curiosities with a hatchet. He was snarling like a dog, in fact. Father said it was the most frightful thing. A week later, Sarah fell forward with a sudden sob. Lizzie put her hand gently on her cousin's shoulder while she regained her composure. "Why would Livermore be interested in the cabinet?" she asked. "He may have been after the box," the widow Borden said. "I do believe he is drawn towards evil and wants to corrupt us all by discovering the secret of the box." Then her face became more drawn than ever, and she moaned. "A week later, my poor Jonathan was found dead in his office. He was slumped back in his chair with the most hideous look of horror on his face. His hand was outstretched on the table, pointing towards the far bookcase. We never knew the significance of the gesture, but I believe that he may have been visited by the shade of our Washunks, Squaw-Sachem of the Secornet." Her hands flew to her face, and tears fell copiously from her red eyes. "Oh, I am the most wretched woman who ever lived. I yearn for peace and for Jonathan." "Mrs. Borden," Lizzie asked, "is there any reason to believe that Elizabeth Wingate is also interested in the spirit box?" "Nay, in fact she seems to dismiss my fear of it as trivial. She claims that when we settle the affair of my poor husband, she will address the box." "Address it?" "Perhaps I shall let her remove it from the premises. She knows how to handle it, more so than Solicitor Coffin would. Yes, I'm sure Mrs. Wingate will know how to contain the evil of the box, and then it will no longer be in our house." "Yes," Sarah interjected. "Let her have it. Let the curse be on her head, the old fake." Lizzie Borden nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Borden, there may be more to this than meets the eye. I do believe I can help you, but I need your cooperation." "And what would that be? Anything to remove this curse from my life." "I need you to schedule a séance with Elizabeth Wingate, here tonight, and invite me along. I need to be present at the conjuration of your husband." The widow Borden composed herself by dabbing a handkerchief to her red cheeks. "Why, yes, that can be arranged. Mrs. Wingate is always pressing me to make another attempt each and every night." Lizzie pressed her hands happily down onto her knees. "Fine then, tonight it is, and with your leave, invite along into our company any members of the legal profession you happen to know, anyone with an open mind for such supernatural matters. Just send a note round my home with the exact time of our congregation, and I shall be here a half-hour before to set up." "Set up? Whatever can you mean?" Lizzie rolled her eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, I merely meant that I will prepare myself for the proper mood. You never know what will happen. It is not every day that I get to meet shades of dead Indians." The electromechanician. Homer Thesiger was called by many in Fall River the boy inventor, but his preferred term for his chosen profession was electromechanician, a word he had first seen used in Telegrapher magazine to describe Mr. Thomas Edison, Homer's most valued role model. He spent his days in his father's basement on Prospect Street, tirelessly tinkering with his electrical and telegraphic apparatus, his endless flywheels, batteries, electromagnets, relays and receivers, determined to be one of the first to make marked improvements and multiplexed signaling. He was regarded by most as intellectually promising, but lacking serious prospects when it came to a career. In the midst of his stubborn and time-consuming work, he often joined Miss Lizzie Borden for some refreshments at the South Main Street Apothecary, where he would boast about his own inventions and visions for machines not yet invented. He held a bit of a torch for Lizzie. He admired the way her mind sorted out a considerable amount of factual data, always managing to piece together a larger picture that was absurdly obvious once you divined the solution, but which had been doggedly evasive during the crime-solving. He felt she accomplished, with the puzzling mysteries brought to her by her clients, what he was attempting to do when he engineered some electromagnetic device, to fit it all together into an elegant and obvious solution. For this reason, his inventive mind and mechanical competence had served her well in more than a few of her detective cases. So, it came as a pleasant surprise one afternoon when Homer received a note by messenger to meet Lizzie at the apothecary on South Main Street, and that he should bring his saxophone, a complicated contraption of rubber tubing and ear-shaped lozenges that were designed to project voices from one part of a room to another. Homer had invented the device for a school performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but it had never been used because it had been so effective that members of the rehearsal audience had trembled in fear of the spectral voices that emerged from its cups. The presiding theatrical director finally deemed the device infernal and had banned it from the school grounds. Homer appeared in the apothecary with his inventor bag slung over his shoulder, the saxophone protruding through the burlap like a bunched serpent coiled inside. Lizzie was up on a stool, sipping her syrup water and tapping her toes on the crossbar. "Homer," she said with a sigh, "you have acted promptly. Once again, I need you to aid me in my exploits." "And what, pray tell, are those?" Homer asked. He was used to Lizzie allowing him only enough information about her proceedings that he needed to know. No more, no less. "I have a meeting of my fluted shaft society at 8 tonight," he explained. "We're designing a cylinder that will capture the human voice in coded format so it can later be reproduced mechanically. We're hoping to obtain a patent and make money selling it to industry. We believe it will replace the stenographer. We're calling it the vocophonometer." "A machine replacing a human voice," Lizzie mused. "This century has brought nothing but technical marvels into our everyday life. But anyway, Homer, I believe I can have you at your fluted shaft meeting by its preordained hour. Here's what I want you to do for me. How well can you climb through shrubbery?" "I don't believe I have any practice in that area." "No matter. The trick is to avoid getting the seat of your pants stuck on thorns. I have faith that you can accomplish that." Homer rubbed his pants legs with a trembling hand. "And," Lizzie continued, "I need you to rig up some sort of harmless explosion. Something with a snap and a bang to it." "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Lizzie Borden, Girl Detective?" She smiled. "Well, I'll tell you, but you must follow my instructions precisely." After sundown, Homer Thesiger, hauling his burlap sack over his shoulder, entered the Widow Borden's French street garden by the side path of the house, and immediately encountered the crunch berry bushes that whispered in the wind below the brightly lit parlor window. Through the glass, he could see a gathering of people, including the Widow Borden and her children, and Judge Mason and his tiny wife. They were standing around the parlor table just as Lizzie had described, and within a moment or two, a rotund woman, dolled up in a headscarf, entered the room fluttering her fake eyelashes. This, no doubt, was the phony spiritualist, Wingate. Homer didn't like her one bit. Imagine taking advantage of poor Widow Borden's grief, and in plain view of the young twins. His eyes lit up a bit as Lizzie Borden and Sarah Borden entered the room, nodding their heads in quaint curtsies and allowing Judge Mason to press his walrus mustache against the backs of their hands. After a few polite pleasantries, they all settled down around the table, and the kerosene lamps were lowered as Wingate sat like an erect Buddha in front of the massive cabinet of curiosities. Her candle flickered upwards, giving her face a ghastly glow as she threw back her head, her eyes going pearly white. Lizzie sat to the side, peering intently, her eyes darting over every minute detail of the scene. Judge Mason and his wife held their silence, clasping each other's trembling hands. The twins hid behind their mother's chair as the widow Borden pressed a handkerchief to her prematurely tearing eyes. Sarah looked as diffident as ever, just like she did in Latin class whenever Miss Handy gave a particularly dull lesson. With a scowl and a silent curse, Homer stepped awkwardly across the dank undergrowth as his ankle caught on some root that arched upwards from the soil. He noticed it was pipe. There was a muffled gasp in the foliage, and Homer froze in his tracks. Fearing it to be a trapped animal of some sort, he trailed his fingers along it and began patting a rounded surface that crinkled like felt. He lifted it and immediately saw he was removing a bowler hat from a figure that was hunched in the bush. With a slight yelp, the person released his breath and threw up his hands. "By Jove!" Homer cried out. "Who the devil can you be?" The hunched figure trembled. "It's only I, poor Tom Crank. Don't be stern with me, Master Thesiger. I'm only doing my contracted duty." Tom Crank was one of the more feeble-minded students at Fall River High School. He had shared many a lunch hour with Homer Thesiger, where he had proved continually how slow-witted his mind could be. Homer shook his head with disbelief and pointed at the pipe. "What's this blasted thing for?" Tom reached up, his hands grasping a tarnished tin trumpet. "It's mere fascination, sir," he said with alarm. "Well, I've been paid my wages. Wingate's got her subterfuge, and I'm a cursed man." Homer grabbed the boy by his lapels and shook him until his eyes went crossed. "You mean you're the one who's been blowing these trumpets?" "Aye, sir. I don't mean to be insensitive to the widow, but I've been paid a most excellent wage. And I always did want to be a musician." Homer released the lapels and stepped back a pace. "You are nothing but a mercenary." "Aye, that I am. And there's no shame in it when you're trying to turn a penny for your hungry family." "Whatever Wingate is paying you, it's tainted money. If you want some redemption for your part in this subterfuge, I recommend you do exactly what I tell you to do." Tom's face contorted, and then his eyes sparkled with some hope. "Oh, to be sure, there's nothing more sublime than to correct crooked ways. Just show me what to do, and I'll do it." Homer reached behind him for his rucksack. With a cherry glow in his eyes, he dipped his hand inside and pulled forth his saxophone, now a tangled mass of rubber tubing. "What in the name of the 12 tribes be that?" the trumpet hustler cried in astonishment. Homer Thesiger, the boy inventor, just grinned. A spirit box opened, a demon set free. Lizzie had noticed from the very first that Elizabeth Wingate was keeping her back to the cabinet of curiosities. It seemed to be a deliberate avoiding, rather than a casual ignoring. Up close, the spiritualist's face was flabby and pasty, and her eyelashes were obvious fakes. As soon as the lights were dimmed and the candlelight filled the room, the rappings began. They seemed to be coming from the table, but it could very well have been underneath the table. Those attending seemed too terrified of them to pay much notice to particulars. "We are gathered here tonight," Wingate said suddenly, "to draw forth the spectre of Jonathan Aloysius Borden from the beyond, from the Summerlands. May his presence here be potent and puissant. And don't forget to bring his checkbook," Sarah whispered into Lizzie's ear, provoking a sharp giggle. Wingate's eye flashed to the side, demanding silence. Mrs. Judge Mason twitched in her seat. "I hope he comes soon. It's awfully cold in here." Lizzie noticed the draft as well. No doubt the window just beyond the parlor door was kept wide open. If all had gone well with Homer in the garden, there should be a lozenge-shaped cup snaking along the floor at this very moment. "Jonathan!" Wingate cried out. "Come forth from the realms beyond." Suddenly, without warning, there was a haunting groan. The two small twins began to cry, and Mrs. Judge Mason let out with a shriek.
"Victoria!"
came a spectral voice.
"Victoria! I have come back to you."
The widow Borden leapt to her feet and held out her arms, tears pouring freely down her face. She was too choked up for words. Wingate stared, puzzled, at the parlour door. Lizzie suspected that she was baffled as to the nature of the voice. It certainly was different from the utterances made by her accomplice in the garden. Homer was being extremely clever.
"Victoria!"
it continued.
"This woman, Wingate, she is not a friend."
Wingate snuffled. "Why, Jonathan," she said purposefully, "you must be confused. I am your familiar, your material basis in the waking world."
"You are nothing but a desperate fake,"
the voice shouted. There were muffled gasps as Wingate sat poker-faced. Lizzie pulled out a handkerchief from her dress pocket and pushed her nose into it, letting out with a sharp sneeze. Then, just on cue, as her hands came down from her face, a terrific noise filled the room. A new voice, warbling, deep and loud, careened off the walls and echoed between the doorways. Lizzie smiled subtly. Homer's saxophone was working its magic.
"This is all Washington's squalsation of the Sarconet,"
it screamed.
"The fires of tribulation are coming down upon French Street, ready to consume utterly the misbelieving. Oh, fly, fly while you can. King Philip shall have his revenge."
The assembled guests stared at each other with alarm, then turned to Wingate, who was sitting with a perplexed frown that outdid their own. "Wingate!" cried Sarah. "If ever there be a time that you confess to fraud, it must be now. You have either gone too far, or we are about to be consumed by the tribulation." Wingate spoke with a choked throat. "Alas, I cannot say this is subterfuge." The voice spoke again.
"Let my words be a warning to your eternal souls."
Mrs. Judge Mason gathered her composure enough to speak a single sentence. "Perhaps, dear," she said hoarsely, her face getting paler with suppressed fear. "We'd best listen to her advice." Then she swooned into the arms of her husband, whose walrus mustache bristled with rage and fury. "Wingate!" he puffed. "Stop this farrago immediately. We've tolerated your frauds because they amused us. But this—" Wingate lifted her empty palms into the air. "I only wish I could." The voice shouted over the din.
"If you do not flee, the house will be set aflame, and all within it shall satisfy the swollen appetite of fire."
Then there was a small explosion that illuminated the room, followed by a smell of sulphur and charcoal. With this sudden assault on their senses, many of those present gasped and started violently for the exits. The widow Borden gathered the twins, who were paralyzed with fear. Lizzie rose from her seat, fearing nothing of course, but curious to see what Wingate would do next. As Mrs. Judge Mason was revived by the pudgy hands of Judge Mason, Sarah, right on cue and with a wink to Lizzie, motioned for everyone to head for the French doors leading to the main hallway. "Fly to safety!" she commanded, and everyone listened to her directive. All but one, of course. Elizabeth Wingate ran straight for the cabinet of curiosities. From the folds of her blouse, she produced a small, claw-headed hatchet, which she raised with terrific violence against the cabinet's glass front. "Got you," Lizzie smirked. The spiritualist deftly smashed the hatchet into the pane of glass that separated her from the prize spirit box. For a brief moment, the flabby woman stared through the shattered glass, then dropped the hatchet to the ground with a dull thud, and with trembling fingers lifted up the shell-rimmed box in the air, muttering under her breath, "I have seized the prize." She swooped it down to be buried within the folds of her blouse, then bolted for the door. "The purloinment of the spirit box," Lizzie thought, "proves everything. This case is as good as solved." Following Wingate out of the house, she came upon an odd scene on the front lawn. Deputy Sheriff Wixon, a tall, handsome man with a generous mustache, was holding Homer Thesiger and Tom Crank by their collars with 2 respectful hands. "Here's a pretty howdy-do," Wixon was shouting. "What is this nonsense? Ghosts and trumpets." "Let my man go," Lizzie and Wingate said in perfect, pitched unison, then stared at each other as if they had both shown up at a ball dressed in the same gown. "Deputy," Judge Mason said, holding up his wife, who swooned with a near-fainting dizziness. "They are innocent. I think I know what has transpired here tonight." He pointed downward to the streamers of rubber tubing that were hanging from beneath Homer's jacket, and the bent tin trumpet that was dangling from Tom Crank's belt. "I believe the poor widow Borden has been the victim of an elaborate fraud to obtain her money and to steal her husband's will." "What?" Wingate sputtered. "My intentions towards the Bordens have been nothing but honorable." She lifted her hands up in the air, as if to demonstrate the straightforward fact that she had nothing up her sleeve. Unfortunately, at that very moment, the spirit box emerged from its hiding space within her blouse and slid down her hooped skirt to the ground, hitting the lawn with an audible thwack and turning on its end twice before coming to a dust-stirring rest. "That," Wingate said glumly, "was not quite to my advantage now, was it?" Mrs. Borden stared in horror at the box, then glanced up at Wingate, who was edging her way towards the garden path. Lizzie stepped forward and pointed a stern finger at the spiritualist. "Mrs. Wingate, I'm afraid I must ask you to remove the slipper on your left foot and snap your toes." The woman's cheeks went slack. "What a preposterous proposal," she blurted. "I'm afraid that I have to ask you to do this toe-snapping right away." Wingate peered about, as if trying to discover some escape route from the garden. With a sudden grunt and a lurch, she bolted from the crowd and headed straight for the path off the property. At first, Deputy Wixon made some attempt to follow, but Lizzie lifted a single finger, encouraging him to stay his hand. Before Wingate could reach the safety of the street, there was a quivering sound, as if a large strip of metal was being twanged, and her agitated body seemed to lift completely from the ground. For a second she hovered in space, as if suspended by invisible entities, and then came crashing with a sickening crunch to the earth. She flopped for a moment and made a crude noise as air escaped from her orifices, and then lay very still and silent. Wixon's eyes were wide with astonishment. "I don't suppose you can explain that," he said to Lizzie. "I can," Homer Thesiger said, beating his chest with pride. "I have laced the path to the street with my super-durable elasto string. The sound you heard was its marvelous flexing ability, like a piano wire being plucked. I have merely set a very primitive trap to catch a sophisticated bird." "Well done, Homer," Lizzie clapped, while Deputy Wixon raced forward to manacle the stunned spiritualist. "And now for the spirit box," Lizzie said, holding up the shell-encrusted container. The widow Borden shrank back with an awful creep. "No, Lizzie! King Philip, our washunks, squaw Sachem of the Sarconet. We shall all be brought to woe." "Nonsense. This is nothing but a curio that Mr. Borden proposed to be haunted to protect its contents. I'll show you." Lizzie lifted the lid as several present put up their arms to shield their eyes from any supernatural events. As soon as they could see that there was no spirit, no blast of light, no demonic clouds or shrieks of the damned, they lowered their arms and peered into the interior of the quite ordinary box. Inside was a rolled piece of paper tied with a red bow tie. "The will," Sarah said. The two little twins started bouncing up and down like one of Homer Thessinger's vertical amusement shafts. "The will! The will!" they were shouting. Mrs. Borden was reduced to tears, seeing her little precious girls so happy. She knew that they understood little, but they knew enough to know that their mother would be made immeasurably happy by the appearance of what they knew as the will. And here it was, the ultimate secret of the dreaded spirit box of the curiosity cabinet. Wixon, who had been poking around the clothing on the inert Elizabeth Wingate, came back to the crowd with a wrinkled piece of paper. "Here's a nice howdy-do," he chuckled, glancing at its contents. The widow Borden took the paper in hand and arched it towards the kerosene lamp that dangled from the back porch. After a moment, her eyes flickered, and she looked as if she would faint. Judge Mason came forward to support her, and Lizzie and Sarah hunched over the paper. It read, "Dearest Winnie, the Borden family is in our proverbial grasp. As long as no one peers into the spirit box, we are safe. Snatch it while you can, and we shall be done with this dreadful business. I deeply regret having to procure the African potion to settle the Borden affair, but the medical investigators were too dull-witted to see past the frightened look on Jonathan Borden's face. It was, indeed, the perfect crime. Let Livermore be your paramour forevermore. My duckling, my fine apparel of warm and swathed womanhood, I shall be yours until the last trumpet sounds. Doodles." Underneath was a crude line, drawing of a man in a top hat and monocle with exaggerated lips, puckered up for amorous activity. 3 X's captioned the drawing. Sarah felt a shudder go through her skeleton, thinking of Livermore being capable of such feelings, and worse, being the recipient of them. Lizzie rubbed her chin. "Doodles? I never would have guessed. Not a logical extraction from either of his names." Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "The man killed my father." "Yes," Lizzie said, staring at her compassionately. "I can only imagine that feeling." The widow Borden snatched the spirit box from Lizzie's hands and held it aloft as if it were some accursed thing. "You have plagued my life through these last few years, haunting my nights and making my own parlour a place of fear. Be done with you!" And she smashed it upon the ground under her foot. It splintered into shards, and the seashells rattled off into the grass. "Contact Joseph Coffin immediately," she announced. "There is a will to process." "Lizzie Borden," Sarah said, placing a congratulatory hand on her cousin's back. "You have done fine work here tonight. Mother, we must reward our girl detective with a most excellent and hearty meal, and an evening's delightful banter with our wonderful family. Even Tom Crank can join us if he chooses, despite his culpability in this affair." Tom snuffled nervously. "I be most obliged. Poor Tom's a cold," and he pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his frame. "Consider it done," Mrs. Borden said, holding up the will in a loose fist. The entire family, Lizzie, Homer, the judge and Mrs. Mason, and Deputy Wixon, all except for the inert Elizabeth Wingate and poor shivering Tom, joined in with a healthy burst of laughter and applause. An evening's recap. The scene at the factory office had been chaotic. The Fall River police had approached Livermore directly, despite their fear of his stature and influence. When the coterie of officers and the arresting lieutenant entered his office and announced their charge, Livermore had cried out, "God's wounds!" and tried to spear one officer with a large fountain pen from his desk. As a result, he had to be tumbled to the ground and his hands tied behind his back with a shackle. As they dragged him through the lobby of the Textile Administration Building, employees who were so used to seeing him cross the marble floors in an ermine coat and stately top hat now saw him frog-march like a snarling beast, his obscene curses echoing off the ornate marble ceilings. Lizzie and Sarah went once to the county prison to see Livermore in his cell. He sat in the furthest corner, swathed in shadow. His eyes pierced the darkness to hit them directly with a cold shudder. "The hag and the harlot," was his only exclamation. Lizzie shot back with, "Perhaps, Doodles, you will be joining Mr. Tweed in chambers more suited to men of your industrious disposition." From the shadows, they could hear Livermore choking with rage and vengeance. Then Lizzie and Sarah retreated and went to the local apothecary to relax over a few mugs of medicinal syrup water, Mr. A.E. Dobbs attending. "How did you know that the will was in the curio?" Sarah asked excitedly. "It was very simple," Lizzie Borden replied. "I knew from the start that Wingate was a fraud. The rapping on the tabletop can be achieved quite effectively by snapping one's toes, and I did notice that Mrs. Wingate had on padded foot slippers, the type you can cast off quite easily just by lifting your foot. She also walked with a pronounced slant towards the left, showing that it was her left foot that was employed in the toe snapping." "Marvelously perceptive," said Sarah, enthralled. Lizzie laughed. "The credit for the discovery of the source of the trumpet blasts I give to Homer Ulysses Thesiger, boy inventor. I was not surprised to see Thomas Crank of Rodman Street involved. That poor boy can be easily led by wolves into walking off a cliff. Fortunately, the law has overlooked his breach of conduct, and he is now at home nursing his wounds. For his role in the affair, I shall honor him with a stipend that will offset his college education, advancing his status in life far beyond what a bobbin boy in a textile mill would accomplish." "That is very generous of you," said Sarah with a broad smile. "Poor Tom is merely a follower, and was exploited by Wingate as much as my mother. We bear him no ill will." Mr. Dobbs, polishing his glasses behind the counter, joined in with fascination. "But Lizzie, you still didn't tell us how you knew about the curio." Lizzie smirked knowingly. "When Homer announced that King Philip was coming to enact his revenge, Wingate ran for Widow Borden's cabinet of curiosities. I found it quite significant that she grabbed the spirit box. I couldn't see how the box would have been of any interest to Wingate. She no doubt wanted to keep whatever was in the box from being destroyed." "Brilliant! So at that point you knew that Wingate was only after the contents of the box, and that she had no other interest in my mother or my family's affairs?" "Yes, and that she was in the employ of Thisbolt. Ajax Livermore was obvious from the picture of her that was in his drawing room, proudly displayed on his mantelpiece. I knew there was a connection between the two." A dark look came across Sarah's face. "But, my word, Lizzie, didn't your father hand over all his money to Livermore?" "That is the beauty of the machinery I had set into motion," Lizzie smiled. "My father invested everything he had, so much so that when Livermore was exposed as a murderer, the Livermore mill went into the hands of the investors. My father is now the de facto owner of the mill. His fortune has quadrupled with one investment." Sarah lifted her mug of syrup water and saluted her newly found friend. "Lizzie Borden, you are truly a girl detective of the first order," Sarah exclaimed. Lizzie nodded. "Yes," she said, "and a girl detective is what this world needs most at such challenging times as these." the two Borden girls, joined by A.E. Dobbs, pharmacist, engaged in hearty laughter and good company, sipped their syrup water and through the smoky glass of the apothecary front, watched the sun settle down on the quiet twilight of Fall River. The end.
About the author. Richard Behrens was born and spent most of his boyhood in the Garden Bay neighborhood of Queens, New York. Richard's work brought him to New Jersey, although he was always a New Yorker in his heart and soul. While living in New Jersey, Richard met and married his wife Anna, and soon afterward they moved to New England. It was in this, the happiest period of his life, that Richard was able to focus on his writing, filmmaking, and podcasting. Richard and Anna co-founded Nine Muses Books, so they could personally publish his writings, including his Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries, for which he is best known. Richard wrote easily in many genres, in both fiction and non-fiction. His fiction short stories and non-fiction essays have been published in a variety of journals. He was also a lecturer on historic Victorian women and on silent film comedy. Richard also was a budding actor and appeared in several local plays. His Lizzie Borden channel on YouTube contains a variety of short films Richard made, mostly centered on Lizzie Borden. Richard's Lizzie Borden podcast examines the Lizzie Borden case with various historians, as well as contains a radio play of The Agitated Elocutionist, one of his Girl Detective short stories. When he learned that he did not have much time left, he said, "But I am not finished yet." After it became tragically clear that Richard would not recover, he indicated to his wife that he wished his writing to be published posthumously. Richard is sorely missed, but he leaves us a legacy of fine work in a variety of media and genres. His wife Anna keeps his writings available on Amazon, and his Lizzie Borden podcast continues under the able hosting of Dr. Stephanie Corey.
Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 34. Find Richard Behrens' Lizzie Borden Girl Detective stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbean, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. Thank you.